Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Nadje Al-Ali. I'm the director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at Brown, where I'm professor of anthropology and Middle East studies. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you for today's event, which will be a discussion with the British Palestinian film director Farah Nabulsi, as well as our graduate student here at Brown, Dima Nasser, about the movie The Present. I'm going to introduce to you Dima. Dima Nasser is a fourth-year graduate student in comparative literature here at Brown. She works on the visual poetics of pain and degeneration in the 1960s Lebanese poetry and art. She is also an associated graduate student with the Center for Middle East Studies at Brown. Dima, over to you.
Thank you, Nadia. So I'm going to introduce the film that we're going to talk about today. The Present, or El-Hidiyya, is a BAFTA award-winning and Oscar-nominated short film directed by Farah Nabulsi, who is, as Nadia said, an award-winning Palestinian British filmmaker, writer, and advocate of human rights. The Present is Farah's directorial debut and was co-written by herself and Hind Shufani. It is about a father and a daughter from the Palestinian enclaves in the West Bank attempting to buy an anniversary present while navigating the inhumanity of Israeli checkpoints. Starring Saleh Bakri as Yusef, Maryam Kanj as Yasmin, the daughter, and Maryam Kamal Basha as his wife Noor, all of whom gave a beautiful and heartrending performance. Welcome, Farah. We're so happy to have you here with us today. And I will now turn it over to Nadia for the opening question.
Yes, welcome, Farah. So, I have to say, the film is amazing. And I felt that one of the reasons The Present is so powerful and moving is, that while the film focuses on a very specific event linked to one family, especially one father and his daughter, the short movie really alludes to and evokes frustration, injustice, and pain experienced by all Palestinians. And, the simple story is clearly based on fiction, but it evokes everyday realities. And so how did you actually approach that relation between the simple and specific and the big themes and challenges in Palestine? And what was your strategy to do that without being didactic?
I think ultimately it's in the personal. So when I'm making a film, I'm telling a story, and people love stories, of course. It's why we're all attracted to good films and books and social media and the news and all of that. And in telling this story, I want to engage. And the way you engage ultimately in telling a good story is you have to go into the personal. So for me, it was a no-brainer in the sense of, like, even if we're going to touch upon colossal injustice or a major issue of this human right of freedom of movement, or we're focusing in on Israeli checkpoints, but ultimately the power of the story is in the human, it's in the personal. And so it was, tell the story on the individual level, what that means. And ultimately you do go where your creativity takes you, and very much the story was based on a reality that not only have I experienced at checkpoints and witnessed Palestinians experience at checkpoints, but I have a friend that I have been seeing for a number of years every time I go to Palestine. And we were standing at a checkpoint that is about 100 meters from his home that he has to go through every single day. So now, I'm talking personally to someone who has to experience this every single day. And he's the seed, his personal story is what this film very much is based on. So it was more, you have the story, you have the personal, and yes, it is then reflective of the macro, but always stick to the personal, because that's where the best stories and connection and engagement can be made. Ultimately, even in a film that has nothing to do with Palestine, it has to be in the personal.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And also I know that in terms of also, my work on Iraq, in terms of moving away from the kind of more dehumanizing grand narrative that people find very difficult to connect to. Dima, would you like to ask
Yes, definitely. And it sort of ties into my first question, building on what you were saying about focusing on the personal. I want to push the envelope a little bit and to play devil's advocate. So I'd like to ask you in plain terms, Farah, given the state of perpetual violence under which Palestinians live, both in the occupied territories and in the West Bank and Gaza, as well as the cycles of intense abuse that we witness over and over again, as in earlier this year, the case of Sheikh Jarrah and other neighborhoods. What do you feel is the purpose of continuing to make films that address these complexities? So in other words, what do you feel is the role that art and filmmaking can still play given this enormously unfair and unjust context? That's a big question. So
but no, and it's probably the one I'll probably give the longest answer to. So bear with me here, because I've literally just written a chapter for a book that is being edited by Ilan Pape and Ramzi Baroud on this subject, the chapter that I've contributed. So I won't give you the 5,000 word version, but I will, so I will start by making a pretty profound statement, I suppose, which is that I don't think film is going to free Palestine and end all the injustice. But I think without film, without art, Palestinians will never be free. Okay, so let's go on this premise of what it is I feel about film and art, because I believe that art and artistic advocacy is the pillar on which all other forms of advocacy stand upon. Or let's say artistic advocacy opens the way for all other forms of advocacy to be more effectively received. So this is the way I see the role of film in the struggle. And that's based on the fact that we know throughout history that every colonizer works very hard to dehumanize the indigenous population they're colonizing, then brand them as barbarians, and then eventually deny their very existence for internal, external consumption, so that people of goodwill will not feel with them. And then any and all atrocities and violence can be carried out against them with no recourse. So if we go on that premise, which we know Palestinians have been meticulously, methodically, systematically dehumanized, then a key element in the struggle is to reverse that dehumanization, is to rehumanize, ultimately. It's very sad to say. Palestinians are human, but we are the victims of that dehumanization. So it's very important to do that. Now, the main way, maybe the only way to do that, is through empathy, speaking to people's hearts. And the way you do that is through art. And for me, film is possibly the most powerful means of meaningful human communication the world has ever known, and the most powerful and far-reaching medium of art. So I think it's everything in so many ways. I think that on the ground, things have never been worse, yes. But in the court of world opinion, I think things have never been better in some ways. And I think that ultimately, film is a form of taking back the narrative, telling the stories in a way that does present the reality, in a form that speaks to the EQ and not the IQ necessarily. You know, we were just saying that, you know, Nadje was saying, you know, when we talk about the sort of macro and all the facts and the figures and the truths and the proofs and the maps that don't really resonate with people. But if you do it through film and through empathy, because ultimately I think it was Dale Carnegie who said, we are not creatures of logic, but creatures of emotion. So it's really important to speak to the EQ, and you can do that through film. So it has its role to play. You can even look back at you know, the role that theatre of resistance, for example, had in the struggle, you know, apartheid South Africa, and how important that was in galvanizing people around the world to understand and feel with the oppressed. So films have a very, very powerful and important role, in my opinion, in that struggle. So I could talk more about this because I feel so strongly about it. But maybe I'll leave it there.
No, I totally agree. And I think another point, as you know, that the fact about film being so easily circulatable and accessible to a certain extent, even though a lot of media and a lot of expression and speech can be censored, film can still sort of reach audiences that it would not necessarily reach if it were, say, you know, perhaps a theater, a play that is performed in one location versus, you know, films like that distribute widely and engage audiences like ourselves today in a context that is far removed. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't forget, I mean, technology, you know, ultimately, a communications revolution is placed in the palm of every single Western citizen in ways that it wasn't 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, right? And so you can break through the traditional gatekeepers of untrue narratives in ways that we never could many years ago, not even that long ago. So technology has been a big game changer. So film as a medium, certainly, and of course, things like, you know, streamers and platforms like Netflix and so forth, you know, the landscape has changed. So definitely film is the most far reaching. I absolutely love theater. I think it really has its role as well. But like you said, it's not as far reaching and accessible.
Yeah, I agree. And I think this brings us to a question Nadje has sort of about the production.
Yeah. I mean, I was just sort of thinking as well, because I think I've never been so acutely aware of the limitations of the medium that I'm using, you know, I'm also telling stories, but, you know, the written word, although, you know, I'm trying to sort of reach a wider audience, I don't think I've ever felt so acutely limited in that, and actually felt like, well, film is the way to go. And I also see it with myself, and I think there's something about maybe especially COVID and also, you know, exposure to internet and social media. I mean, the attention span, you know, I find myself, I'm an academic, I can't listen to like hours of people giving academic papers. I mean, I'm just going into a different zone, and that's happening to me, right? And I'm of a generation, I didn't even grow up with, you know, Facebook and social media. So I also think that really in terms of, you know, younger generation and the way that our sort of brains have been changing, I also think that film is a much more sort of effective medium to tell stories, to, you know, to raise people's consciousness, to, well, I mean, in your case, you know, contribute to the important process of rehumanizing, as you rightly said, say, Palestinians. Yeah, so I guess my original question was about production. I'm going to ask it, but I guess now, based on what you said, I think there's also, of course, a question about circulation, because I mean, I know lots of sort of independent filmmakers in Iraq or elsewhere in the Middle East, and yes, they make films, but they're not being seen, right? So then there's also a question of circulation and, you know, the importance of that. So if you could sort of reflect on that, and then maybe sort of somewhat linked, but a bit different, you know, the question of production, as Dima already mentioned. I mean, you know, when I was watching the film, I was sort of wondering, so how did you actually get the shots at the checkpoint, you know, big checkpoint, I think it's called checkpoint 300. And then did you actually set up the smaller checkpoint? And, you know, what were actually some of the main challenges of filming and producing the present?
Well, I'll touch on, so the initial part of the question discussion to do with distribution ultimately is what you were asking me about. I mean, it pains me to hear you say that you know of filmmakers who are making films and no one's seeing them. And I think things are relative. I cannot believe, I refuse to believe that people make a film and no one sees them. So, you know, ultimately you make a film because it's an expression of your own creativity. It is, you know, you getting to know your own identity as a human being, as a filmmaker, and for me, in my case, as a Palestinian as well. And there will always be an audience. Now, it's more about how large that audience can be. And we've just touched upon the idea that, you know, the landscape is changing. So definitely a filmmaker of today versus a filmmaker of 10 years ago. I mean, you know, YouTube, that alone made a difference with, you know, how you can access, but ultimately it's a numbers game, and you want more people to see your film. I'm assuming every filmmaker wants the maximum number of people to see their films. Maybe not, but you know, most filmmakers, I assume. But really, you've got to start on the premise of making a good film that can engage, and we can talk, you know, the halo effect as well. Ultimately, you can make a film that is so personal to you, but is not relatable, or people cannot engage with, and so you've already limited what audience or you know, the connection you can make. So it really is not just the message, but the messenger and the way it's presented and so forth. But ultimately, in my case, I went down the normal path of you know, being a filmmaker who then applied to film festivals, and it clearly resonated with the festivals. It was officially selected. From right at the get-go, at that point, we had sales agents get in touch. Because we had been selected to a top film festival for our premiere, sales agents naturally got in touch. Again, for short films, this is not, it's rare, don't get me wrong. It's not common, but it did happen for us. And from that, we signed with Canal Plus before we even won the audience award at our premiere. So we already, the distribution had begun with biggest French TV channel, you know, that was wonderful. And as the momentum built, so did the interest and the, you know, with the distribution. And many people believe that we ended up on Netflix worldwide because we were nominated for an Oscar, but that's not the case. Netflix, we'd agreed 2 months, I'd say, maybe even 3 before we were even shortlisted for the Oscars or the BAFTAs. And so I'm just giving you, you know, perspective. And I can't actually mention this, but I'll give you a slide. There is something coming out on Netflix in a couple of weeks, which is exciting. It's Palestine related. And just to show you that that momentum is there. And it's not just because of the Oscars and the BAFTAs. There is an interest and a desire to engage, but we have to provide the content. I can't speak to, you know, exactly the situation with Iraqi filmmakers or Syrian filmmakers, or, you know, but I do know you go down the path, you've made what hopefully is a good film, there is room for it to be distributed, as I've seen with the present. It has been widely distributed. So it can happen. But with short films in general, just to be clear here, Palestine or not Palestine, short films in general, it is known extremely hard for distribution. Anyway, sorry, I went off on a bit of a tangent there, but the world has changed. As my point is that the landscape is not what it used to be. And so I think the opportunity has increased. In terms of production of the film, I mean, so you're rightly, Checkpoint 300 is scene 2 of the film, where you see sort of hundreds, you know, a few thousand Palestinians going through what I can only describe as a battery farm for cattle. I mean, this is, you know, so inhumane. It is a real checkpoint. And that one, I was just explaining, I was just on a call a bit earlier with some students, that we went in with no permissions. It was very much documentary style, that scene. And we did that during the prep period. I didn't want to take a chance of shooting it during the actual shoot period, just in case, something was, equipment was taken or we were stopped or anything like that. And we went 2 cameramen, no lighting, and just knew how far we could go by staying under the radar a bit. And we shot that. So that was pretty nerve-wracking, but I'm really, really happy we shot that. And I always say that's a scene that I didn't have to have in the film. I mean, you could have just left that out and the film still carries on from the next morning and carries on, and nothing would be missing. Except it was really important for me to have a little bit of that backstory. Who is Yusef? What is he going through every single day? And just by showing that scene, to me, spoke volumes. So not just about Yusef, but about every one of those people who were, who it represents ultimately. Yeah. The checkpoint for the rest of the film, we constructed that, and we had to actually keep it in the car park of a church, under wraps for a little bit, until we were ready to actually shoot. So we were kind of creating it, and Kanj was our production designer, and I had sketched out exactly, how I wanted it to look and how it was going to work. And it was based on this checkpoint a specific checkpoint in Hebron, of which the seed of the story was born. And then we placed it, and it was in an area A. For those who don't know, the West Bank, occupied Palestine, divided into areas A, B, and C by the Israeli military. And areas A are, where you can expect to have less issues. The military come less often. There are less checkpoints. It's frustrating because I would have preferred an area B or C, quieter, not in the city centers and things like that. But we placed it in an area that looks quiet to you on screen, but wasn't so quiet in reality. And interestingly enough, the surrounding Palestinian communities actually thought a real Israeli checkpoint had been erected, and they were quite distressed. And I was a bit distressed to hear that. So I sort of sent people out and said, please let them know it's not real, we're just filming. But I was secretly quite happy because it meant that the checkpoint was authentic, really that the people thought this was a real checkpoint that had been erected. And so, we just, that was it. Those were the two checkpoints, and I don't know what else specific to the production you would want to know.
Well, I mean, I guess, were you ever sort of challenged by, for instance, Israeli military, while you were filming it? I mean, did you have, in terms of getting clearance to film, how did that work?
Well, so back to this zoning. So these areas A, B, and C. So you make choices. I mean, you tend to avoid wanting to find locations and use locations that are B, C, specifically C. Yes. You're not going to get permissions, and you don't really want to have to ask for permission from the occupier for whom you are making film. It's funny, a Haaretz article, an interview I did say this, but then they made it the headline, which is, I don't know, I don't believe we should be asking Israel for permission to shoot their illegality. And I believe that. I mean, we're going to go ask, can we, so for me, if you stick to the areas A as much as possible, then you're really dealing with the Palestinian municipalities and ministries. And, they're very helpful with that. And you hope for the best. Now, ultimately, in my case, don't forget it was a short film. So, we weren't there for months on end. We did not have any problems, so to speak. It was annoying that not too far away on a hilltop from where we were shooting, the main checkpoint, there was a settlement, an illegal colony, where they were drilling the entire time as they're building new houses. And it was the most frustrating process because, of course, with film and the audio and all of that, it was just drilling. If you recall in the scene where he's in the cage, The sound engineering there actually has drilling, because I decided that's it, I'm just going to embrace this annoying drilling and sound engineer it into that scene. I only regret not having shot the settlement actually, retrospectively. I just said, oh, damn it, why did I not, actually shoot the settlement? So that was very frustrating. And then ironically, on the last day of shooting, and we've just wrapped, we finished the last scene, and we're all getting in the cars to head back into, the main part of Bethlehem to have our sort of wrap party, if you like, or, and a flying checkpoint appeared. So it was kind of like, oh, well, I'm glad that appeared now and not during our shoot, but a flying checkpoint appeared, and a flying checkpoint, so there's over 100 military checkpoints all over the West Bank. And then there's another sort of 100 or so that can appear anytime, anywhere, known as flying checkpoints. And so, a Jeep had pulled up, set up a checkpoint, and of course, everyone's day was kind of ruined. For us, actually, we were going in a different direction, so we were okay. But it was very ironic in that moment to go, okay, that's what this film, this frustration of it and everything. So, but I could say things were smooth. I'm happy to say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Before I'm going to hand over back to Dima, I'd like to encourage the audience. We will have some time for Q&A. So if you would like to put in a question or comment, please do that in the Q&A function of the webinar. Dima?
Yes, thank you, Nadja. So I would just like to circle back to this idea of how the film is so short. But to me, it seemed to focus and pay a lot of attention to the concept of time and how time passes during the span of one day in a wasteful manner, and how absurd and unnecessarily difficult it is for Palestinians in the West Bank to do something as mundane, that should be as mundane as picking up groceries or shopping for a gift. And I know that you sort of, you alluded to this before, it being based on a personal story of your friend, but I want to know if there's a reason beyond that you chose to tell this story about this family as opposed to the many others that could be told also at checkpoints on a daily basis.
Well, I think so that ties up with a couple of things you said, because it's the personal. So ultimately, for sure, this story is based on a cruel, absurd reality that hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Palestinians deal with. So I'm under no illusion. The inspiration was this particular friend of mine, but it is reflective and should be reflective of the much bigger reality. Now, I mentioned I go where my creativity takes me, right? So that's, in many ways, you get that inspiration, you have a download, you have a premise of a story, man goes, gets object that doesn't fit. The conversation I had with my friend at the time, as we stood and looked at this monstrosity, I said to him, okay, what if you needed to bring a new couch home? Because his checkpoint, that checkpoint has a metal detector and a turnstile, and he said, if it doesn't fit, it doesn't go. Okay, so now I've got this story, and the conversation got even more absurd, where I said, okay, if you want to bring a hammer, that fits. And he's like, do you want to get me shot? And it was so absurd where the conversation went. But so that's the story. I've had a download, I've had an inspiration for a story. But I can also say that the interest and intrigue for me to do with checkpoints is, number one, because it is something that impacts so many on a daily basis. Okay, so while at the same time I could say having your home demolished is horrendous and far more painful than having an object not fit through a checkpoint. And of course, we know that these checkpoints, far more upsetting things happen at these checkpoints than things not fitting through. I mean, people are killed, shot, women give birth at these checkpoints. I recognize that. But let's say having your home demolished, that's not something that happens to hundreds of thousands, millions of Palestinians on a daily basis. for me, these checkpoints, while they're just one part of this much bigger control system that comes under military occupation, apartheid, control systems, control of movement, it is one that touches on so many regularly, daily. And that human dynamic for me was interesting when you look at the micro, what that means on the individual level, and then have a think about what that must mean for an entire nation of people. Mm-hmm. What are the human dynamics? What is the impact that can have on entire communities? So we start with the man and his daughter in a family. But what about the community? What about an entire nation that are having their right, their basic right of freedom of movement controlled and not just controlled, stolen from them? I mean, ultimately, this basic human right that so it's fascinating to me what that impact must be on the bigger scale. So it was twofold: the creative story that came, and then this kind of examination of what that means on the bigger scale, and focusing on that.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Nadje?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, I'm going to ask a question and then link it to one of the audience questions, because there is a connection. So I was fascinated by the relationship between the father, Yusef, and the daughter, Yasmin. And, there's lots of tenderness, there's playfulness, but there's also seriousness, fear, frustration, and then there's courage. So, and then there's the last scene where Yasmin pushes the fridge through the checkpoint, and there is a moment of hope. And so my question is, what is your relationship to hope? But if you can hold this for a moment, and I'd also like to link that to Lisa Savage, who asks, the dad's meltdown over the fridge not fitting through the checkpoint structure was scary to watch, with heavily armed IDF characters reacting to his anger. The daughter finds special courage and strength right at that point in the plot. Did she intend to make his anger the catalyst for her decision to act? Or was the humiliation of having her soiled pants displayed with disgust her turning point?
Okay, so there's a lot.
Yeah, there is a lot. Yeah.
So it was neither to me, but again, it can be your interpretation as to what it was that caused her to do what she did. For me, in many ways, the choice of having. So let's be very clear here. The most fictitious part of this story, which is very much based on a cruel reality, is the ending. Okay, and I know I'm under no illusion that the more realistic outcome actually is, lethal force, arrest, injury. But it was a choice, and it comes back to you when you said hope. This idea of offering an alternative, something more hopeful, a suggestion, if you will, of the youth coming out stronger, wiser, more defiant. So then back to the question, which is, for me, that's what it is that I don't know if you noticed, but he puts her jacket on, the jacket when it was raining, on her, his jacket. And he's now shrouded her almost with his own pains and his, the oppression and all of it. The red jacket is gone. And then when she does do what she does, she removes it. And she's back in her own agency and power, which for me is kind of taking off the chains of that oppression and being more defiant and choosing what is the most logical, humane, correct solution. Why is it a Palestinian cannot use the road? I mean, it just, so as the child, that's just so clear and obvious. Well, you know, I'm just going to use the road. It doesn't fit. We're going to use the road. It's the adults who have got it upside down and who, you know, have caused a huge problem of not just the checkpoint, of the entire reality. So for me, she represents that. She is the hope. She is the alternative. She is more defiant, and she's more logical. I mean, it's you know, in that sense. And of course, ultimately, she has watched her father go through this humiliation, which it's not just her, it's every Palestinian child, youth, who not only experiences the indignities of checkpoints themselves, like even soiling her pants, but witness their hero fathers and mothers in impotence of these soldiers, of this humiliation. What does that mean? What does that do to an entire society? So yeah, I think it's a combination. But you asked me my relationship to hope, and it's very important to me. It's kind of like you know, the James Baldwin, I cannot be a pessimist because I'm alive. You know, I have to be an optimist. It's so important for the work I do, and for not just the work I do, but as an individual. Otherwise, really, the injustice is so colossal that it can really, you know, result in frustration and depression. And very much I've begun that way, by the way, in kind of recognizing what it is the Palestinians have been experiencing for decades, but being able to channel it through my filmmaking is so important to me, and it's driven by hope. And I recently actually did a sort of Harvard course on public narrative, which confirmed to me the belief that all social movements tend to be led by the youth because they combine the two aspects. One, they recognize injustice is happening, which adults, you know, the older generation do as well. But the younger generation have hope, which sadly much of the older generation don't have. And you need the combination of the two. And so for me, I cling to hope very much, despite not being youth. But I cling to it because it's so important. It's so important to be able to push forward. So for me, in the same way as James Baldwin said, I'm forced to be an optimist.
Yes. Yeah. No, I understand that. Yes. Dima, do you want to move to another audience question?
Yes, I'm going to sort of take the liberty of choosing one that seems really meaty. Shirina says, "Dear Farah, thank you so much for sharing about the making of The Present. Could you speak more about the gendered dynamics as they're performed at the checkpoint? The vulnerability of Yusef at the checkpoint in tension with the figuring of his Palestinian masculinity as threatened by the soldiers, and the invisibility of Yasmin, who you just spoke about, you know, taking off her father's jacket and reclaiming her agency. But her invisibility as a girl child who turns protector and hero at the end of the film is so interesting. The most heartbreaking point for me was when Yasmin acknowledges her father's inability to have helped her when she has an accident while he waits in captivity. So could you speak more about the gender dynamics as they play out at the checkpoint?
That's a very interesting question and perspective. You know, I always say that it's Yasmin, you know, a child, but interestingly a female, that takes the fridge and goes, you know, and I did in many ways want him to have his daughter versus a son. For me, you know, it is interesting that I think that the role that females or women are playing, and specifically in Palestine as well, and is so important, and not just important, but has been vital. And you know, an interesting documentary for anyone to see if they're interested to sort of understand that a little bit more was Naila and the Uprising. I don't know if people are familiar with that documentary, but that's a nice one to watch. Now, ultimately, I empathize very much with the impotence that Palestinian men have to cope with in occupied Palestine. I can't tell you why specifically. It might play to the fact that I have 3 boys of my own. It might be that because I've spent a lot of time in Palestine and I've been at these checkpoints myself, and so I've really witnessed men, women, children, elderly, all of it, subjected to these checkpoints. But specifically, I pick up on how men are treated at these checkpoints. It doesn't sit with me very well in terms of what that must mean for them, just, you know, in their masculinity and in front of their children. Same for women, don't get me wrong, but I think that it's something that we always talk about in let's say in warfare or in Palestine military occupation, all that is women and children. Mm-hmm. But there's also something that we really must not overlook, which is what it does to the male society. And again, on the micro and the macro. And I just, you know, for me, I think this relationship between, you know, a father and a daughter is just something I think everyone and anyone can relate to. And so, yes, I could have easily had him with his son or a son, but I did choose for him to be with his daughter. I wanted that tenderness. I wanted the desire to try have a normality in what is a very abnormal reality. And in many ways, it was beautiful that it was a female that was the hero, if you like. I don't know what else to specifically add to that. But I appreciate that, you know, being brought up, and it's something I should, you know, maybe even think about a bit further.
Mm.
Yes, it was very on point.
Mm.
Could I sort of just ask a follow-up question about Yusef's character? So why did you choose to give him chronic back pain? Why was that an important artistic choice? Just because I'm really interested in theories of pain and representations of physical pain. So I was
I heard what your thesis, I mean, when it was your thesis or your PhD or your pain and suffering. So I think that there is a tendency when we look at injustice or you know, something happening across the ocean somewhere, or, you know, and we focus on the reality and the apparatus, and, you know, so in this case, the checkpoints, freedom of movement, military, you know, but we forget that the people who are suffering all of that still have to contend with all the other crap in life, okay? You sort of have to forget, you just think, oh, this is really bad, look what they live under, fine. But they also have to deal with all the other pains and frustrations of life, whether it's rain when you're out with your child, or a kid needs a bathroom, or physical ailments that any Tom, Dick, or Harry around the world could experience. It could be migraines, it could be a slip disc, it could, you know, Palestinians don't just suffer under military occupation, and yet they are just, everything else in life is just dandy and life is great, and, you know, otherwise, and they don't suffer from any health ailments, or, you know, to me it was really important. I wanted him to have an ailment that anyone else can have in the world,
right?
You know, because Palestinians contend with all of that. If I'm going to make a character that is human and is relatable, and you have to understand that they have to deal with all the other things that we all have to deal with, plus the checkpoints, plus apartheid, plus the military occupation. It's not that they are separate to that, you know? So for me, it was, I recall very clearly sitting with him, and I said, look, I want him to have an ailment, a physical, I don't know if it's a migraines, if it's a, and Hind actually suffers from a bit of back pain, which is a perfect example of, someone who isn't living in Palestine, who suffers from back pain. I said, perfect. That's what I'd like him to have. I want him to have back pain because, and just imagine if you live a life with back pain or a slip disc or something, and you don't get to jump in a taxi, or you don't get to, you have to wait at checkpoints for hours on end. My God, that's extremely frustrating or painful. Or so that's it. That was the thinking behind it.
Thank you. Nadje?
Yeah, I think I'm going to address another question here from the audience. We spoke about Yasmin, the character, and John Castellucci has a question about the actor, and asking, how did you, he says, how did you coax such a moving performance out of Maryam Kanj, and was it tough on her?
It's so interesting. First of all, Maryam, she'd never acted before. She had been on sets before because her father is a production designer. And interestingly enough, he was a production designer on our film. I didn't know that when the connection was made that I'm interested in Maryam, and that we just hired, Nadje Kanj, her father, to be production designer. Now, I fell in love with Maryam in the sense that I went very much with my intuition. A friend of mine, I told her, I've just cast Saleh Bakri as Yusef in my film, and I need to find a girl who's about 8 years old, speaks Arabic, lives in Palestine, can act. And ideally, I'd like her to look like her father in the film. And she said to me, what about my niece? I said, what about your niece? And she showed me a picture, and my jaw dropped, and I went, oh my God, like this could be Saleh Bakri's daughter. It was weird. So I didn't know if she could act, but I know she'd been comfortable in sets before. I know she'd been an extra here and there just because she's on those sets. And I went to visit her, or I was on my trip to Palestine to begin the casting process and all that for the rest of the roles. And I went to meet with her, and I fell absolutely in love with her. The difference between an adult and a child in terms of the sort of acting, in the sense, is that you're almost better off with a child who hasn't been acting, because what you're really looking for is the EQ, is the emotional intelligence. And Maryam is extremely emotionally intelligent. So not only did she have sort of these expressive eyes she looks beautiful in that sense, but she got it. She's emotionally intelligent. And that's when you're directing a child, for me, it was speaking to the truth of the reality of what it is that she is, performing, to say, look, if that's your father, this is what you're experiencing, so forth. And she would get it. Whereas if you have child actresses who, for example, a parent is running over lines with them, or, somehow they think they're putting on a performance, it can become quite rote and unauthentic. So I'm really not only very lucky to have found Maryam the way it happened, I very much went with my instinct. I knew she was the one. The minute I met her, I was like, oh, okay. I did go audition a few children, but I just knew she was the one. And look, there were moments where, she's a child, and she doesn't have that much dialogue. So, we'd be shooting something, and I'd be saying to her out loud even, okay, Maryam, keep going. Okay, looking in that direction, please. And then at some point she'd turn and look at the camera. And I'm like, no, don't look at the camera. We had our struggling moments. We had, and I'll confess to you, I even brought a puppy to the set I was like, does anyone have a puppy? Or, you know, because it's long hours and it's, you know, and again, I'm a mother, I have kids of my own. So I think that helped in the process of just knowing how to speak to her and deal with her. But it's very different to how you coax, if you like, a role out of, you know, a seasoned actor like Saleh Bakri, who is a different kind of conversation, and what I had to do with Maryam.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to read out another question here. I like it sort of going in a quite different direction by Sarah Al-Kidim. I was really interested in the music added into some of the scenes. What were some of the important elements you feel the music added to the story, even though it was non-diegetic? For me specifically, the scene where Yasmin is waiting for her father to be let go at the checkpoint stands out, with the background drilling also heard. Also, what sort of thought was put into the absence of music in most parts of the film?
Well, that's just it. The choices of when you don't have music, the choices when you do have music are equally as important. So it's almost like when you choose not to have music, you have very much made a creative decision. In many ways, the entire film doesn't need music, and as you noted, it doesn't have that much music. I did want to have a little bit of specific ambience. I felt that in the moments the music, you know, the choices of when I had some music, it wasn't melodramatic. I wasn't trying to sort of orchestrate emotions or guiding people's emotions through the music, because frankly, the performances did that, and what you see on screen did that. But I did feel that it added just an extra creative dynamic. And as I mentioned, you know, this, the drilling, you know, that the sound engineering very consciously brought it in. And to me, in some ways, it's very metaphorical of this eruption and the layers of eruption that Yusef is experiencing as he paces in the cage like a lion back and forth. And so it was just an interesting sound engineering combined with a bit of music that I felt made for part of the dynamic elements of the storytelling. And I definitely wanted something more contemporary. So, you know, for me, it was, you know, I said to Adam, look, I'm thinking electric guitar, bass guitar. I didn't want to go with sort of traditional or sort of what some would even say you've gone for a more Orientalist view of how the music should be because it's set in Palestine, or I just wanted something that I thought would just add to the film creatively and in a contemporary manner. And I hope that the balance was there, because yes, there were times when we could have added music in other places, and I just didn't think it was needed. It's tempting because I love music, but you've got to make decisions of when you just don't need it. And I wanted it to also play out as authentically as possible. Some people describe the film as almost like a documentary, you know, and it's very weird. In some Q&As, people ask me, you know, was that real? Are those real soldiers? And I'm kind of like, this is weird. Why would people think those are real soldiers? There's just no way those could be real soldiers, you know. But to the extent that they've kind of transitioned into, is this really happening? And I suppose scene 2 with the real checkpoint kind of, you know, throws people a little bit. But
yeah. So unfortunately, we are almost out of time. I think we probably have time for one more question. Dima?
Yes, it's really interesting that you mentioned the question about genre, but I think we're going to sort of wrap it up with a question about reception. So how do you feel the film has been received both in Palestine and among Palestinian expats and in the diaspora, but also, and this ties into a question from the audience, do you have any sense of how the film has been received in Israel or among Israelis?
So with Palestinians, the best messages and the best kind of reactions I've had that are the most rewarding to me personally have come from Palestinians inside Palestine and Palestinians in exile all around the world. And far more than any, award and media coverage and all of it, where Palestinians have either kind of said, that was me yesterday, thank you, I feel like I've been seen. And Palestinians outside, really championing the film and feeling like they have some kind of engaging tool to even share with their friends who don't quite understand the reality. And it's crazy to me when people have used the present to say, this is the reality on the ground in Palestine, because I'm thinking, this is only one little bit of the reality.
Right.
But yet, if you think of people who really don't know much about what's going on, it speaks volumes to them, I suppose, in that sense. So, people from outside, also interestingly enough, I've had some Palestinians, even as recently as I've just done a recent trip there, Palestinians in the West Bank telling me that friends and relatives who are in 48 Palestine, so in Haifa or Nazareth, or that some of them didn't actually really realize, I guess, the human side of what it is their Palestinian brothers and sisters inside the West Bank experience,
right?
Which was fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of turned around and said, "Oh, I didn't." Now, of course, that's to say that there's many, of course, do know, but there's many who don't, which was shocking to me and surprising. But I'm really glad that has opened that understanding and dialogue as well. And I have had, of course, the occasional Palestinians from inside who were like, "Good job, but this does not show, enough of what it is that we experience," and so forth. And bless them. I'm under no illusion. I know a lot more, far more of what goes on. But I've chosen to make a short film. Specifically, yes, it was a checkpoint. We cannot possibly tell the entire Palestinian story in a 24-minute film. And so I understand where it's coming from, that the pain of what it is they're suffering is sort of saying, but what happens at these checkpoints is far worse. And I'm like, I know that, I do know that. But again, you choose how you're going to tell a story and what is the story you're going to tell. So that has occasionally happened. But overall, incredible reaction. In terms of Israeli reactions, I don't really know. I mean, it's on Netflix worldwide. It is available there. I'm sure many have watched it. I don't personally know, what their reaction and reception is. And nothing worth mentioning in terms of, yes, of course, I get the occasional horrible, hateful message on my social media or something. It's not even worth mentioning. It is the reality. It is what it is. So, I hope that Israelis are watching the film, and I hope that it has some kind of impact. But I got to be honest with you, that's not my target audience. My audience, in many ways, is, of course, cinema goes in that sense, but is a Western audience. Of course, if there's a Jewish audience out in the world that watch the film and find it, it resonates with them, that's great. But it's ultimately, I didn't make this film for an Israeli audience. I would love an Israeli audience to watch it. I'm sure some have, but I don't sit there taking my kind of opinion poll of what it is the Israelis think about their, own oppression of,
Which is fair. Thank you so much, Farah. Nadje, should...
Yeah, we have to wrap up, unfortunately. Yeah, yes. So, thank you as well, as Dima said. This was a fascinating conversation. I think Dima and I could have been in conversation for you for hours. So much to talk about, and have many more questions. But yeah, I mean, many, many thanks to you. Many thanks to Dima, Barbara, and all of you who attended.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.